Before saying anything else and before entering into the few words that I've put down on paper, I'd like to thanks for this incredible journey of discovery that happened here today. Really, if John Berger says that cinema is about traveling, I traveled to so many places thanks to your presentations this morning. And I have to say that I come from a generation that was raised when I was an adolescent in Brazil. We were living under censorship, so many of the films, for instance, from the Cinema Novo were films that we couldn't access. And the way to truly understand about what those films meant or were was through the work of thinkers like yourselves. And Lucia, you're such an inspirer today of what Ismael Xavier and José Carlos Avelar and his generation of film articulators, truly offered my generation. And so you are kind of expanding this perception to me today. So I'd like to make a few special thanks. Thiago, thank you for this this dive into melodrama and what eventually grants meaning or not in a film narrative in Central Station. Made me want to revisit Douglas Sirk, which I haven't seen in a long time, and maybe Todd Haynes when he traveled to that kind of territory with Carol. Thank you so much for this. Stephanie, also obrigado for your presentation, Cinema and Soft Power. And I have to say that you really touched the chord there, because Ailton Krenak was such an inspiration for that film. I talked with him, and the screenplay was really based on a conversation I had with him, to do When a Terra Treme. And then when you brought Visconti, I was completely humbled. I said, oh, let's not compare the two films. So thank you for that. Natalia, I traveled with you through every single one of those vehicles and those scenes in the films I co-directed with Daniela, or the films that I did myself. It was really fascinating to see how you interwove all those, all those, and articulated all those thoughts. I agree that On the Road ticks too many boxes. I wish it had ticked, much fewer boxes than it did. So I apologize for that. Cecilia, thank you for delicately touching the walls of your Janquet's work and of A Guy from Fenyang. And to show us how deeply interwoven film and memory are. That was so touching. And to go from voyeur to traveler to observer was quite a trip. And after Cecilia was a great influence on allowing me to understand all the possible layers of Gia Janquet's film, as Cecilia is such a specialist of his work. So it's wonderful to see this on screen and to revisit our journey, the journey that we did collectively. Lucia, the foreign land mise en abîme is something that I want to share with Daniela Thomas immediately after this, because it was so brilliant. And the insights and correlations and collisions between the center and periphery that you built on screen. The correlation between the shipwrecks in foreign land and the state of of things. The shipwreck was, I think, the point of encounter of all of us at that moment, and I think that we are today in an immense shipwreck as well in Brazil, and thank you for bringing that to the surface at the end of your speech. It was absolutely brilliant. So if I was today to find the same kind of way into films that Ismael Xavier and his generation brought to me, I would come to Reading, and I would come to you, and I would come to this group of people to truly understand what the texture of film is. So I feel very honored to be here, and humbled. I never thought I would be here today, nor that I would spend the morning that I did. I told a friend, Geoff, that I felt a little bit like as if I was the first person to sit on Freud's canapé. So many thanks. And so a few words about my doubts, angsts, hope, and thanks. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you, the University of Reading, but especially everybody in this exceptional Department of Film, Theatre and Television, most especially Professor Lucien Agibi. I feel completely undeserving of an honor such as this. And if I may invert the words of Marx, Groucho, not Karl, it is a privilege to be part of an institution that, whether out of generosity or a very brief lapse of judgment, invites me as a member. So thank you so much. As you well know, a film director never works alone, so in our inherently collaborative process, I feel that the distinction that you're giving me is something that I need to share with all the co-authors and collaborators in my films. So briefly mentioning actors as extraordinary as Fernanda Montenegro, Fernanda Torres, Gael Garcia Bernal, co-directors such as Daniela Thomas, truly close friend and inspirer. My brother, director of photography, Walter Carvalho. Masters such as Nelson Pereira dos Santos, film critic José Carlos Avelar, figures of inspiration such as Donald Branville, I think is a duty I have to do now. In the same sense, a film director never emerged fully formed. So perhaps with the exception of Chaplin, who, as you know, was seemingly born knowing how to write, act, direct, edit, and compose. And for the rest of us mortals, an occasion like this is also an opportunity to look back at the mirror and understand what led me to embrace this calling. So when I was a child, and not by an option of mine, I lived in a country that was truly cold. I missed the tropical light. I missed the street culture of the city I was born in. I felt a keen lack of all of this. I was driven by a sense of not belonging to that place and to that culture. I think maybe that is still somehow reverberating throughout each of the films that I did. And I found refuge in the double billings of a little repertoire movie theater in the neighborhood of where we lived. And in the sky of that cinema, I was transported to the unknown. And I was maybe 12 or 13, and I discovered, for instance, Flaherty's Men of Erin. I was transported to Death Valley in Ford's The Searchers, to the internal and physical frontiers of Vander's Alice in the Cities. But beyond the physical geography, I was drawn by something I think much more important, which was the extraordinary human geography in these films. By the close-ups at the end of City Lights, by the close-ups of the peasants rebelling against the religious powers in Eisenstein's The General Line, by the extraordinary expressivity of Anna Magnani singing in the first minutes of Pasolini's Mamma Roma. I confess that it made sense, finally, to live in this other country named cinema. On the screen in the dark room, everything was way broader than the world I knew, the cramped universe of my own family. John Berger defines this very feeling in his essay Every Time We Say Goodbye. The cinema, because its images are moving, take us away from where we are to the scene of action. Paintings bring home. Cinema transports us elsewhere. In the cinema, we're all travelers. Later, I was to learn the importance of dissonance with Lindsay Anderson's If, about what the structure of classes were with Losey's The Servant, about social injustice and fascism with Rossellini's Rome Open City, about transcendence with Dreyer's Jeanne d'Arc. Cinema, for me, became a tool for understanding the world. Something so sacred that truly I never conceived the possibility to be embracing this profession. And once again, a film changed my life, and that was The Passenger, that I had the honor to discuss yesterday, or learn from Laura Mulvey and from Lucia yesterday in the conversation that we had. The crisis of identity of its main character, David Locke, was mine as well, and perhaps, of many of my generation. So we're now in June 2022. When I received Lucia's invitation, we were in 2019. We had no idea of what lay before us. Since then, we've lived through a pandemic, and its effect on all of us has been incalculable. Overnight, it's as if we found ourselves in the unsteady position of the man who, in Jia Zhangke's Still Life, tries to cross a tightrope between two buildings in ruins. Beyond the millions of lives lost and the catastrophic consequences in a number of fields, the pandemic has deepened abyssal inequalities and drastically altered our habits. In our field, social distancing and the closure of collective spaces served to accelerate a crisis that had been gaining traction since the digitalization of cultural media. I believe that this chronicle of a malaise foretold transcends cinema. The digital revolution and the multiplication of screens, and so precisely depicted, by the way, by Theo Anthony in his documentary All Light Everywhere, marks a new stage in the development of late capitalism. Ours is a time of head-spinning abundance and velocity. Each app on our phones, computers, and TV performs some sort of mediation, and above all, allows for the unprecedented surveillance of consumer behavior. The ability to store, cross-reference, and analyze our behavioral data has created what Shoshana Zuboff refers to as, quote-unquote, behavioral surplus, a new form of accumulation which is clearly designed to feed algorithms and systems of artificial intelligence, and which may ultimately not only reflect the public taste, but determine it. In the shadows cast by surveillance capitalism, we find the tentacles of the Cambridge Analyticas of the world, busily at work in country after country. In this gray area, the future of Republican political representation is at stake, as well as the future of activities that seek to hold a mirror up to our shifting identities, as does cinema. In its essence, cinema is an extension of the cave paintings of Altamira and Lascaux in Europe, or the Cuevas de las Manos in Argentina. Those drawings came out of our need, at different points of our journey across the planet, to live a reflection of who we were. Those paintings betray an irrepressible desire for artistic expression, the desire to seize a moment and make it eternal, and the perception that those images define and distinguish a group, a very specific group, and a very specific place. A single account offered up for all to enjoy. Cinema is nothing but the continuation of that desire, what Bazin used to call a dramaturgy of the real. That which the camera captures is ultimately reality and its mysteries. In other words, if cinema is to exist, it needs shadows, the unseen, the unsaid. This realization was what led me to admire filmmakers of such different styles and origins as Abbas Kiarostami, Wim Wenders, Nelson Pereira dos Santos, Suleiman Cissé, Djibril Diop Mamenti, Agnès Varda, Barbara Loden, Lucrecia Martel. Their common trait, perhaps their sole common trait, may be the perception that cinema is the invisible that complements the visible. The viewer is left to prolong the open-ended work, to carry it out into the world, as we have always and still do when faced with a painting that leads us to imagine what lies beyond the frame. This motley chorus represented us, from the cave paintings to the multiple schools of cinema, to just the other day. And these practices, guided by such powerful specific notions of time and space, are now shaken to their core. Cut. We're now in December 28th, 1895, with the Lumière brothers. We are in their first public screening using the cinematographer. For the Lumières, cinema was justified as an invention dedicated to the public, a collective projection on a vast screen. And this is what led, the collectiveness of it is what led Blaise Cendrars to refer to cinema as the youth of the world. For over a century, that founding sensibility spread across the planet. In a matter of years, cinemas envisioned by the Lumière brothers took over screens on all continents. Brazil, for instance, had a truly very early intuition for cinema. In 1909, more than 70 films were done in Brazil. It's so early in time. And that includes documentaries, short films, and the first feature films. 70. We now do 12, 11. Thierry Frémaux, who's the director of the Lumière Institute, beyond being the director of Cannes, recently reminded me just how much the current questions facing cinema as a form of expression created from the collective stem back to its birth. That is, to the opposition between the Lumière brothers' cinematographer and Thomas Edison's kinetoscope. As Edison envisioned it, The kinetoscope was designed for one single viewer who would pay for the chance to see a small moving image inside the box. The Lumière, on the opposite, wanted to take the image outside the box and project it on the large screen. And Frémaux says, I'm quoting, "From a technical standpoint, Edison might have invented cinema if he had had the idea, the intuition, and the passion for it. But instead, he lost it, both philosophically and commercially. Since its inception, cinema has been about a desire for a collective projection on the big screen." Back in 2022, I'm left wondering to what extent streaming platforms are the continuation of Edison's original design. That is, a kind of cinema that is served and produced for individual consumption. In this rearrangement of civilization, there's a revealing semantic shift that affects all moving images. Streaming platforms are meant for consumers rather than viewers. The person who creates a series, for instance, is no longer a director, he's a showrunner. Okay, a few weeks before coming to Reading, I received an email. I don't have social media in the telephone, and I have to confess that I watch emails maybe twice a week or so. So I already apologize if we're going to have an email exchange and the answer doesn't come rapidly. And one very strange email landed from a gentleman I had never heard of. And he said that the algorithms of a platform had suggested me as the ideal director for a project that he had, that he's producing and writing. And it was a project that he had, for which he had already casted and chosen the whole crew, from director to editor. I mean, everybody was, and of course I was, increasingly surprised by it, but mostly so when I heard that it was the continuation of Homer's The Odyssey. Which is even more disturbing because for me the Odyssey has always been the framework on which many films, to start with, as Paris, Texas, for instance, have been constructed upon. So I wondered, was that a sequel? or should it be described as a spin-off? And then the words of a Greek poetry I love, which is Kavafi. Here, Kavafis, you probably pronounce it, I don't know, came to mind, and he says, "Ithaca offered you a marvelous journey. Without her, you would not have set out. She has nothing left to give you now. And if you find her poor, Ithaca would not have fooled you. Wise as you would have become, so full of experience, you will have understood by then what these Ithacas mean." So I'm sharing this with you, but I didn't share it with the gentleman who, by the way, 2 days ago sent again the same email. And as strange as that email seems, I thought that it says a great deal about our time. From Homer to the algorithm, it sums up the state of things. Yes, narratives continue to affirm their vital importance. And yes, they are still with us in our daily lives. Perhaps more than ever, but the question may be, how? And also, and more important, why? Apparently, in the digital era, the desire seems to be fewer Homers, more of these algorithms. As Laura Mulvey say, please allow me a small bifurcation. I have to say that this is not a summary judgment, and hybrid forms of cinema interest me as a viewer. So just to recall a few interesting hybrids that I've seen in different moments of time. I'd like to recall Carlos and the Best of Youth, the truly wonderful TV miniseries by Olivier Assayas and Marco Tulio Giordana. Kieślowski's magnificent Decalogue. Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage and Fanny Alexander, which moved with grace between TV and cinema. Not to forget the rough, the edginess of Made in Britain, Scum, and other transgressive films by Alan Clark, made for the BBC. And in Brazil, Eduardo Conchinho, also, who is our most extraordinary documentarian of all times, offered us truly thought-provoking work while he was directing for a weekly news program called Global Reporter in the 70s. And of course, how could I forget Twin Peaks, which David Lynch had the gall to direct and show on Sunday at prime time on the TV network. And yes, I have adolescent kids, and I confess to them that the Duffer Brothers, guys from Strange Things, know how to place a camera. So, it is eminently possible to find moments of oxygen and creativity on streaming platforms, like Jane Campion, Martin Scorsese, and Steve McQueen have shown. But these tend to be exceptions that confirm the rule. How many films that defy preset parameters are cast into a black hole today by programming dictated by algorithms? What are we losing here? When I traveled across Latin America to do the Motorcycle Diaries, I was so enamored by the difference between not only the human maps, the human landscape, but also by the accents. Now I moved to Argentina 6 months prior to the shoot just to be able to fully grasp Spanish and to be able to understand the differences as we moved from country to country, So the film was shot in that constantly shifting physical and human landscape, and was influenced by tastes, sounds, different forms of music that could only belong to very specific places and cultures. I really had the sense that we were in a last frontier. And the film, I think, is the result of the crew's collective enchantment with that diversity. Years later, when I tick too many, I traveled across another continent, and each small town we found, and in each small town we found only the very same fast food chains. It was a vast cultural desert, a string of abandoned historical city centers. And I had an enormous difficulty to actually register some form of diversity within that terrain. I think that you can see the result in the limitations of the film. So the exercise of diversity is what has produced movements such as the cinema novo that Lucia referred to, the Iranian cinema of Kiarostami, all the way to the young Panahi now, the sixth generation of Chinese filmmakers led by Jia Zhengke, the new wave of Korean cinema with an array of talents ranging from Bong Joon-ho to Hong Sang-soo. All of them reveal that the world is far broader than we could ever have thought. In light of all of this, what future can there be for cinema? Is there still a place for the collective enjoyment of a single audiovisual work which will be felt differently by each person in the dark of the movie theater and transformed by that collective experience? Only the big screen can bring out the full power of a close-up. As Dreyer once said, nothing in the world can be compared to the human face. It is a land one can never tire of exploring. Circling back to where it all began, the Lumière brothers may help us to reflect. You see, the Lumière brothers, they didn't invent cinema, they discovered it. And I wonder, in a little bit of angst, if we are not close to a time where we have to find ways to rediscover it. And for a start, by resisting Hollywood's view that movie screens ought to be reserved now for blockbusters aimed at teens, the Marvel series, and that independent cinema should be relegated to niche platforms. I find that insufficient, to put it mildly. And a few recent experiments have risen to the challenge with robust, invigorating answers. And I was recently invited to take part of collective presenting, showing a film to a collective experience that was built by a young guy called Valerio Carocci, that I don't know if you heard of, you may have. With his friends, this guy in the early 20s occupied a movie theater that was slated to become a supermarket in Rome. The theater is now back in full swing and is at the heart of a renaissance for Roman moviegoers. And each summer it takes over the piazzas of Rome, and that cinema travels to open-air screenings and that gather around 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 viewers. And a lot of filmmakers have been going there to actually introduce a film. That was us to introduce Motorcycle Diaries there. And what is surprising in that experience is that if you take a look at who is watching the film, they're basically in their 17 years old, 15 years old, people discovering cinema or rediscovering cinema. So that is one experience that really offers some kind of hope. And other cities have, been leading similar experiments. Barcelona is. And as I speak, a campaign is working back to bring back a cinema in the suburbs of Rio that had a great importance to shape audiences in the 2000s, called Ponto Cine. This is a cultural battle and a political one as well. As Brazilian film critic Pedro Bucha has said, movie theaters represent a twofold resistance to the demands of the new attention economy, in that they allow for a different experience of time by privileging a collective experience against the grain of a drive toward individual consumption and collective engagement mediated by technology. Similarly, while the largest streaming services are laser focused on producing new content, the issue of memory and access to the history of cinema has become increasingly urgent. Film archives and initiatives for restoration and preservation have become more vital than ever. So, to return to Blaise Cendrars, where is the youth of cinema today, or where can it be? There's no answer to that, or there's not one single aspect, but there is one brought about by technology which strikes me as truly important to the answer. While surveillance cameras can map faces or consumers in real time, with all the attending political implications of that, it is also true that people can wield portable cameras as a form of resistance in real time. The brutal murder of George Floyd only had the consequences it did because a person recorded the atrocity with a cell phone camera. In Brazil, young indigenous leaders often use their phone cameras to denounce the violence and the attacks cheered on by Jair Bolsonaro supporters in the Amazon. Sometimes talking about 18, 19-year-old young leaders from those communities that are just registered that as filmmakers, and offering a reflection of what is happening in their culture. Similarly, the films created by the Forensic Architecture Collective take pre-existing images often captured by surveillance cameras and deconstruct them using a fundamentally innovative aesthetic procedure. These films circulate in multiple spaces, including film festivals, museums, and the internet, but are most crucially screened at courts in defense of human rights as evidence of crimes against humanity. It occurs to me that these gestures are, above all, an extension of the practice of cinematography. That which is recorded or filmed is a reflection of our era, created by someone who, in that moment, becomes an author. At a time when we find ourselves constantly struggling against alternative truths, alternative facts, amnesia and the erasure of memory and history, each fragmented image becomes essential. There is something in the gesture that recalls the African which director that in The Passenger takes the camera from the hands of David Locke and turns it on him in a subversion of colonialist logic. In this sense, I think that the most striking film I saw this year is just 2 minutes long. It's a single take in which the camera delicately observes a man sitting in the middle of the forest. He's singing an indigenous song. Other people, off camera, raise their voices and join him. the song comes to an end. The camera does not cut. Then the man calmly smokes a cigarette in communion with the forest that embraces him. The images are of the indigenous expert Bruno Araújo Pereira, who was murdered a month ago in the heart of the Amazon, alongside Dom Phillips, who contributed to The Guardian, who was also brutally killed for defending the forest and its peoples. Can I show you this clip?
Marina Wakenade, Marina Wakenade, Wakenade, Marina Wakenade, Tabarini Heza Wedani, Tabarini Heza Wedani. Awanararai, Awanararai. Kalamari, Kalamari.
The cinema has died, but it is reborn with every gesture, with every scene, such as this. So, before ending, just an idea crossed my mind. Bruno, who was the largest, the most important indigenous specialist at the FUNAI, which is now stalled by the Bolsonaro government, spoke the 6 or 7 languages of the indigenous povos indígenas, so you say,
peoples.
The indigenous peoples from just this region, just this one region, had 6 or 7 different languages, and it's this kind of respect for the difference, for the local, for what makes things unique and not reproducíveis. So do you say that? And
not reproducible.
Not reproducible. That I think is at the basis of the strength of cinema, and will continue to be. If there is cinema, if cinema is to continue, it really has to rely on this kind of respect and respect for the other, and for the one who is different from you, for what you are. So salam cinema, salam cinema to all of you, and I hope that we can look at the future with a certain optimism, and remember of a sentence that appears it was written in the walls of Paris during the May '68 student upheaval, which was let's be optimistic and leave pessimism for better times. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Walter, for this incredibly touching presentation. It touched on so much and on so many of us too, and ended with this amazing and tragic note of the death of Bruno and Don Phillips. I do hope that this event serves as a homage to these two heroes and martyrs of a ruthless government. We have time for questions, and I invite the audience. I have my own thoughts, of course, but please do volunteer any questions that you might have, or comments, suggestions. Cynthia.
I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment, but just thinking about these streaming platforms, what strikes me is not only that the algorithms are controlling what we see, what gets produced, but also that we no longer have physical copies of these films, and sometimes these streaming platforms, they own the films and they simply remove those films, and then you can't find it. It's like those films, they are gone. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts about this, because the DVD is now becoming obsolete as a format.
No, I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
I mean, the difficulty of finding films that you are actually expecting to watch, but then get immediately lost because they didn't perform in the first 24 hours in a platform is a tragic, an absolutely tragic event. And as a platform controls the right of each film that they produce, you don't actually have a say in any of this. So that's one of the I think undercurrents of what is going on. That I would say that what I also miss with the idea of this single experience that the platforms offer you is the possibility to decant a film is what happens immediately, because as you binge watch, right, and you go from from episode to episode of a series, or from film to film, what you miss is also the possibility to actually articulate, to get into what you watch. I remember in Rio, before actually the second wave of the military coup d'état, which was in 1968. 64 was the military coup d'état in Brazil. In 68 it got worse. And in between those two things, there were still cinemas that people would watch a film, but going to the bar after the film was as important as actually watching the film and disagreeing. And be able to articulate thoughts and allow the film to decant. And this is also something that I think is we have to learn how to deal with it, and how to bring back the possibility, like in Rome, for instance, of watching a film and then people just stay and celebrate and talk about it, that the platforms truly ruin that kind of possibility.
They don't even let you watch the credits of the film.
Yes.
Like they immediately take you to something else
absolutely.
in 5 seconds.
Absolutely.
Even if you don't grab a remote control, you're already watching something else.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There is even just a coda to this. When you buy a film online, you think you can watch it forever. That's not true.
No,
because
days or something.
from time to time,
And different platforms are different. Yeah.
they remove, Amazon removes the films that you had purchased.
It's gone. Yes.
The same with the books that you think you have on your Kindle, and you go there after a few years, they have disappeared. So they stole it from you. They cheated you into believing that you had an object and you don't have it anymore. But Adriana has a question.
Yeah, I was just curious, when you mentioned that the problem seems to be that within platforms, you have this issue that algorithms, determine how long a film stays on the platform based on popularity. But you have the counterpoint, which, for filmmakers who do, like me, I pursue independent filmmaking, we also have the very real challenge and fear that the cinemas and exhibitors do exactly the same thing. If your film doesn't perform well in
Yes.
box office within 24 hours, they remove your film that was supposed to stay on for 4 to 6 weeks. You have it on for 1 week and it disappears. So, I mean, I agree with you that platforms have brought this challenge, but I think the problem is a bit wider than that.
Yeah, I agree.
And my question therefore is, do you think the pandemic might be, in a strange sort of way, the way to rediscover cinema? Because I do sense there was a saturation among people, being cooped and confined, being forced to only watch films through platforms. And I felt now going to Cannes for the first time after the pandemic, there was a desperation to be among people again, watching films in the old-fashioned way. On the beach, the cinema plage, where you have hundreds of people queuing up in order to have this experience of communal cinema watching. And I wonder if that could be a rediscovery of a sort of old style of making films, just like Stranger Things, has in a way been a rediscovery for a new generation of teens, of classics like Kate Bush and other, So is there a possibility that, ironically, the big bad, platforms might be the reason why we rediscover cinema, helped on by the pandemic, maybe?
Well, there is certainly a feeling of saturation created by the inflation of images, the unlimited multiplication of images that are being offered, and you can sense that by the number of people who are not subscribing anymore to the platforms, which they did during the pandemic. I was really surprised. I hadn't traveled for a while. I was surprised to see how many people were walking in the streets of London, but also were in airports on the way, and how I think this atavistic desire to be among others, it is something that we carry from before Lascaux and Altamira, if that is not going to resurface. If you look statistically, the countries that control the pandemic well, like New Zealand and Australia, the frequency of cinema, of traditional cinema, but also of independent cinema, continues to be very, very high, even higher actually. The desire of people to see their own reflection, is what created this interest, and so if the pandemic if we get some stabilization, it's possible that we go back to this. Two things during the pandemic that I'd like to point out that are could be interesting. One is that in Brazil we didn't have access to vaccines in the beginning, so everybody was in a kind of a lockdown, and I was in a lockdown, but with Lubitsch films. And I got my 2 adolescent kids to watch To Be or Not to Be, and all the other wonderful Lubitsch films, and they completely fell in love with it. They wanted more of that. So I was like the algorithm that was kind of feeding them constantly Lubitsch films. So it's about the offer, truly, isn't it? And they completely forgot what they were seeing on whatever platform they were accompanying, because there was something that was wittier, faster, and felt fresher than what the platforms were offering them. So that gave me a certain, a true optimism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Stephanie, and then back there, and then Cesar. Okay, let's go a little bit into the tea break. Okay, go ahead. But be quick. Can you summarize your
I
question?
speak very quickly anyway, as you know, Lucia.
Okay, thank you.
I thought it was really interesting, Falta, that when you went back to the Lumiere brothers, you mentioned the first screening rather, so you go back to screening rather than going back to filming. And it reminded me of, I think it was Jean-Claude Bernardet writing about early cinema in Brazil, and saying importance, in the Brazilian context, importance was put on screening rather than filming. So there was this impossibility of separating film from the market, which I always think is a really interesting argument. And I mean, you mentioned that I mentioned La Terra Trema and Balzan's take on that film, and he's loved the film but said it was really boring because and you thought it was sad that it wouldn't find a market. He may not have used that term, but it wasn't going to engage with an audience. So I was just wondering how you think of yourself as a filmmaker in terms of an audience and a market. Do you regard yourself, because your films have certainly lots of your films have found huge publics, so they're situated very much, I guess, at the end of a more commercial. I'm not using that as a dirty word at all.
No,
I work on popular cinema, so it's not dirty. That more commercial end of an art house. Is that how you see yourself and see your films?
Well, first, starting with the Lumières, the beauty of the cinematographer is that it was, at the same time, the camera could register a scene, but it was also a projector. So that if you had that one instrument, you can somehow encompass the whole, the whole idea of cinema was contained in that camera. Whereas with Edison, who, by the way, created, not Edison himself, but his assistant, creating o negativo. How do you say that?
Negative.
The negative, so he had invented the negative before the Lumières. It was not the same. The projection, the kinetoscope would not project. So there's a kind of philosophical separation, at bay here that I find truly interesting as a starting point, but also as a kind of collision that still reverberates today. As of to come back to films, when I start a film because I cannot not tell that story, and whenever I betrayed this desire, I missed the film. I somehow didn't hit it right, and today you've shown a 2-minute short film shot for Venice, and images of that. For me, it's a feature-length film, and it found its audience in the sense that it was made for that specific thing, and I wanted so much to tell about it, to do it based on 2 images only, and was it the only thermometer that I can use is the fact that, yes, at the end of the day, this is what I wanted to say at that moment. And then sometimes it finds a reverberation and finds publics, and sometimes it does not, when we were doing the Motorcycle Diaries, we were enamored by it, but we never knew where it was heading. Fernanda Montenegro, when we were doing Central Station, she said she would always call me meu filho, my son. It's interesting because it was a father and son relationship, and it was reproduced in the set. And she said, we're doing this, with such passion, but will anyone see this old, incredibly boring old lady, fighting with this kid, will any spectator come, and we had the same angst when we were shooting the Motorcycle Diaries, and many times I thought, are we going to get to the end of this insane journey, and then somebody like Gael said, okay, let's go, and then at one point when he would feel that, it wasn't, somebody else would come, and that's the beauty of the collective experience, this is why I cannot dissociate also the collectiveness of the shoot and the collectiveness of the sharing of the film at the end. It's very difficult for me to make that separation.
Tiago, very quickly, and then Cesar, very quickly.
It was just a compliment for the previous question. It was quite funny that we started to discuss about distribution, and I don't know if you know that Anitta, which is probably one of the biggest pop stars in Brazilian music scene today, posted a message about Brazilian cinema that was quite interesting. I'm going to quickly read in Portuguese, it's very short, but if you want to help me with the translation, it's quickly like, gente, eu queria pedir encarecidamente que alguma plataforma disponibilize nossos filmes com legendas em inglês para fora do Brasil. Poxa, eu tenho que mostrar um pouco da cultura e do humor dos filmes brasileiros para os meus amigos estrangeiros e quase nunca consigo. Até agora só consegui mostrar a Cidade de Deus e o stand-up do Whindersson. Tentei Carandiru, não achei. Tentei Central do Brasil, nada. As séries também não. Justiça, Desi Gonçalves, Hebe Camargo. Nada com legenda em inglês. O filme do Palhaço Bozo, do Paulo Gustavo. Nossa, tanto filme bom do Brasil e não consigo achar com legendas em inglês para mostrar para os estrangeiros como o cinema é mara. Tinha que ser.
If she bought DVDs, she would find all these films.
She doesn't know.
That's the problem. So, just a very short summary of what he said. He said that Anitta, this famous singer, very popular singer in Brazil, she's complaining that she wants to show so many Brazilian films to her friends, but that none of them have, by the way, she lives in the United States today, and none of them have English subtitles. Sorry to cut you short, Tiago, let's get the last...
But it's very related actually, but the question is about piracy. What do you think of piracy and the role of piracy into this? Because a lot of these things I'm sure you can find online, and fan subs are incredible these days. You can find a lot of people working for nothing, subtitling films from all over the world online. So.
I have to find refuge in Jia Zhangke's answer to us when his films Platform, for instance, I think that The World was the first film that was authorized in cinemas in China, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And so Pickpocket and Platform, for instance, were not. And he discovered that those films were being in fact distributed in DVDs, and he had very ambivalent reaction to that, because on the one hand he said, this is what is allowing millions of people to actually access those films. On the other hand, they're accessing those films in a way that is not why I didn't film them to be projected in a small screen. Cinema is the intersection between time and space, and the space is necessary also when you watch a film. And he told us about the first projection that he tried to do in a bar. Remember that? And then when he got to the bar, a coffee or a bar, he realized that the place was completely translucent with, there was just glass everywhere, and the film was projected, but nobody could watch anything. So, and therefore I have very, very ambivalent, reaction to that. But I think, sometimes you discover things that you would only discover there, you know. Also about popularity and commercial, the story with Jojanka that you know of, and I'd love to share rapidly. Gia, when we were shooting, sometimes would go on, a Chinese kind of platform,
social media.
Social media called Weibo. Weibo, and I said, do you do this concept? He said, yes. I decided to create this thing to actually share ideas with people, and I asked him at the beginning of the shoot. He said, how many people access that? They said, no, it's a disaster. Very few people, 25 million. By the end of the shoot, a week later, it was probably 30. But that's
proportions for you.
that's the proportions in
Yeah.
China. Yes.
Yeah.